my program, along with the Latin American Studies program, is pleased to help welcome Professor Mitchell Seligson from Vanderbilt University. He's done a lot of excellent work on surveying in a lot of different Latin American countries, public opinion surveys, and we're going to learn a lot today about that particular topic, which is obviously of the essence in Latin America today, questions about public opinion about democracy and populism and other important issues of the day. So let's please welcome Professor Seligson here with us.
Thank you. I'll be talking about challenges to democracy and democratization in Latin America today, but I'll be doing this in two parts because a lot of people are actually interested in how we do this, how we actually figure out what people think in Latin America. And our work is somewhat different from your standard Gallup poll where they call you on the telephone, because many Latin Americans don't have telephones and therefore we can't call them on them, and even if we could, we would have a really biased sample because only wealthier people have them. As a consequence, we do a lot of face-to-face work, and so the first part of my talk will be presenting to you about how we do this. I'll spend some minutes about how Vanderbilt and my students and my colleagues in Latin America do this, and then I'll be presenting some of the results from our 2006 wave of the Americas Barometer. Most of our work, or much of our work, is supported by the United States Agency for International Development. That's provided several $1 million in the last couple of years in support to Vanderbilt and the project, and we're very grateful to them. And the United Nations Development Program has been a sponsor, as has Vanderbilt University been a sponsor. The overall project is really the Latin American Public Opinion Project. I was Peace Corps years ago in Costa Rica, and it was the only democratic country at the time and a place that you could actually carry out surveys. And I started doing surveys of the peasantry and poor people, agrarian poor, and learned how to interview people. And out of that, when Latin America started to democratize, I sort of scaled up to the point where now we're doing a lot of the region. So that's the effort that we're doing, and let me describe what we're doing. This is actually not downtown Baghdad. This is downtown La Paz, Bolivia, and this was only a couple of years ago. The issue of the stability of democracy and whether Latin America is going to remain democratic or return to authoritarian ways is still very much in question. Countries like Bolivia had a long sequence of presidents who didn't complete their term. Ecuador has got the same kind of problem, of president after president, really turnstile presidents. And we see events like this. This is, and it's serious stuff. It's not only tanks, but if you read Spanish, there's 15 deaths. Here are these soldiers who were in the process. There were a lot of riots and killing people. And on the protester side, the protesters aren't exactly, Gandhi pacifists. They get pretty serious. That's dynamite in the hands of the Bolivian protesters. They throw these sticks of dynamite in protest marches, and people get killed. So there is a real question as to whether or not in all parts of Latin America democracy is consolidated, and whether the values of the population will support an ongoing effort to keep the countries democratic and not slipping back into authoritarianism of the military type, or different kinds of authoritarianism, such as what we see in Venezuela today on the populism. This actually event actually ended in that enormous demonstration, which brought down another president, a democratically elected president, brought down by another kind of process, a mob process, in which actually forced him out of power, as many presidents have been forced out of power in Latin America. Let me talk about how we do our work, sometimes under pretty challenging conditions, like the conditions you saw there. But we began our massive surveys really in the early 90s, when Central America was still caught up in the throes of civil war. Our very first cross-national survey was done in 1991, in which one of my interviewer teams got caught up in a crossfire in one of the neighborhoods in San Salvador, and in Honduras. My interviewers were arrested by the military, and their questionnaires were stolen from them. So they were arrested and then drafted into the army right there on the spot. Okay, so it was a kind of a real shock from doing interviewing to carrying a gun the next day. But that's the kinds of challenges we face. So let me talk about it. Those of you who are interested can go on to the website. This is just a screenshot of the website that we have. And it shows you a map of the world of the places that we're working in. You can click on any of those countries and download our reports of what we've done. And some of these surveys go all the way back into the to the 70s. Some of them, for example, in a case like Bolivia, we have surveys in 98, 2000, 2002, 2004, 2006. These surveys are long and have a great deal of information. You can download, and I'll show you how you can actually, without any cost, just sit there and actually produce percentages, cross tabulations, and so on. We've also traveled to other parts of the world. Madagascar, you'll see there, Israel. We've done work in Albania, largely focusing on our corruption work. This is now for the World Bank, where they've copied our stuff. That arrow there on the right shows you our where it says where you can click to download the tabulation. And these are some of the things, but you can take a look at that material. If you go online and you want to download tabulations, our Costa Rican partner manages our website. Our website for downloading data is managed in Costa Rica, and our website generally is managed in Quito, Ecuador. And this allows you to look at the data sets you want. For example, in this case, this was Latin America 2004. The theme was corruption, and it's just the language. A public employee they're using the word mordida, which is bribe. There are different words for it, but has a public employee ask you for a bribe, and we'll give you those actual results later on in the last year. And this is broken down simply by sex and no and yes and so on. And you can get these percentages, and you can do more. This is sort of the dummies version. There's a more sophisticated version that you can plug into where you actually can start doing regressions and so on. This year, in 2006-2007, we're working in not only South America and Central America and the Caribbean, but we've managed to get Vanderbilt University to support us to do North America. So for the first time, we've got comparative results for the United States and Canada. And some of those results are pretty interesting in terms of what they show us, and I'll present a little bit of that for you in my presentation. We have all the countries in Central America. We've got the Andes covered. We have Guyana. For the first time, we've actually been able to work in Haiti and Jamaica. Here's Haiti, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, and Guyana. Our missing areas, there's some senator passed a rule saying the United States couldn't spend any money for these kinds of projects in Argentina, and so we can't get the money to do that. And the big hole that we're interested in trying to fill right now, and some conversations we've had here at Brigham Young about the possibility of collaborating on trying to get Venezuela. We have a Venezuelan researcher there as we speak, trying to see if we can bring them into the process. The other big hole, of course, is Cuba. The University of Havana has invited me many times to go, but the constraints are that my questionnaire and the data all have to be processed through the government, let's call it what it is, a spy agency, and I won't do that. I don't have any associations with intelligence apparatus, and so we can't do Cuba, at least from inside Cuba. Let me explain to you the process how we did this. We first had a meeting at Vanderbilt University last May, sponsored by the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP. They brought together, or rather we brought together with their money, the best and the brightest in the field. This is Ron Engelhardt, who's responsible for the World Value Survey, talking to our group of scholars here, the guy who runs the New Democracies Barometer here, and our Chilean counterpart, and Jim Gibson, who's done all the work in the Soviet Union and South Africa. These group of people were brought together, as well as people from the National Academy of Science, to help us work on the questionnaire design, what we ask, because what you ask is, of course, crucial as to what kind of results you can end up getting. We had also a representative from the Arab Barometer, which is the newest of the barometers. Professor Jamal from Princeton University runs the Arab Barometer, along with a well-known political scientist from the University of Michigan, and she was presenting her results on the Arab world, which is not an easy part of the world to crack in terms of these surveys. From that point, we went down to Santo Domingo, Heredia, and Costa Rica, and we brought together all the research teams. Here they are gathered around the table, our people from Salvador and the Mexican team, and the Honduras team and the Nicaragua team, and so on around the table, Costa Rica team, working through the details, the final details of sample design, and taking the inputs from the UNDP meeting and working out questionnaire design. And here we had presentations and discussions over a period of several days until we finally came up with our final version. Here we have part of our Costa Rican team, the Chilean team, the Colombian team together. And here we have the team from the Caribbean. We have the two colleagues from Haiti who were working on the questionnaire, because there we had to do the questionnaire in Creole. And in places like Bolivia, we do it in Quechua and Spanish and Aymara. In Guatemala, we have to do the questionnaire in Spanish and 4 or 5 indigenous languages, Mam, Cachiquel, and so on. So it gets kind of complicated when you get all these things in there. But the idea is to have the questionnaire being asked, trying to ask the same thing to all the people so that everyone gets the same stimulus. We try to use a single thermometer so that everyone is registering on that same thermometer, not just asking general questions like, what do you think about democracy, how's it going, and then trying to record generalized impressions. Back at Vanderbilt, this is what we call LAPOP Central, and this is our crew. Most of them are graduate students. We have 8 graduate students studying under me for the PhD, people from Ecuador and Uruguay and El Salvador and so on, are Haitian, and we meet together every week. In fact, the fact that I'm here today, I had to fly yesterday, meant that we couldn't meet on our traditional Wednesday, so I get back, and tomorrow afternoon we'll be having our weekly meeting to discuss the latest advances in the surveys. And these students actually are involved in analyzing the data. And as this morning, before this meeting, I was editing one of the chapters that this guy wrote from El Salvador on the problem of crime and its impact on democracy. Okay, so we're doing that, and we'll be presenting all these results to a series of meetings throughout. This is our headquarters, the LAPOP headquarters, where we have our weekly meetings, and each of the students has their own offices where they process the data. Let me now get more into the substance of the thing. We design samples, because this may be a question, to really represent the countries. This is Bolivia. Easy part to get, a densely populated suburban area where the interviewers don't have any major challenges in getting door to door. We use a mapping system in which we identify the households that we need to get into. I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A if you'd like, about how we figure out who to interview. In many of these countries, we've been using handheld computers, PDAs, which we're trying to link to satellite mapping so we can do a better job, but that's the process we're in now. This is easy. This is hard. Okay. This is also Bolivia. The density is extremely low. Bolivia is a large country with a small population spread out over large areas, and much of Bolivia looks exactly like that. Okay, and the cost of our sending people on trains and canoes and horseback and so on into these areas is very, very high. But the idea is we don't want this sample to represent what a lot of samples represent, which is just simply the urban, easily accessible, often telephone accessible populations. We're trying to get the population, allowing us to divide it by different areas. And so what we have, for example, this happens to be Ecuador. And what we do is we divide the country into 3 major strata: the coast, the mountains, the Sierra, and the Amazon area. And so our samples in this case represent, we can't represent an individual town or village. We interviewed 3,000 people in here, Spanish and Quechua, the two languages. And we can represent the coast and compare to the coast to this highland area where the largest bulk of the indigenous population lives, to these new areas where oil and migration and so on, and also these complicated areas along the border with Colombia where the conflict is going on, the violent conflict and the seeping of that conflict across the border into this area. In Colombia, we also do surveys every year in Colombia, and we have specialized samples in the guerrilla area, which is particularly interesting for us. We haven't yet lost any interviewers, but if we do, it's in the interest of science, and we have to pay a price here and there once in a while. So that's one of the things we have to do. This is, on the other hand, Bolivia. There, the country is organized into 9 provinces, sort of the way we have states. And so our interview actually carries out in each of these areas. And most people do interviews in La Paz, Cochabamba, Santa Cruz, where the bulk of the population lives. But we were able to interview in Pando, for example, where if we would interview properly in terms of the percentage of the population, we'd interview only 27 people. But we interviewed 300 people there and weighted them down so they'd reflect the percentage of the population of the country. Then, once we gather all this data, we disseminate it. You saw something about the web. All of our studies are available on the web. We make a series of presentations. As we speak, we're in the final throes of preparing the presentations for the Dominican Republic. Last weekend, we had the presentations in Panama, and so on. These are country-based presentations done by our academic partners who produce monographic works and present lectures to the NGO community, to the foreign policy community, and to the civil society about the results. And now we're going to be sort of taking it a step higher where we do regional presentations. We have this summer presentations planned for Washington, D.C., Capitol Hill, and the think tanks in Washington and Mexico City to try to get this out where we're bringing our scholars together in one place. We have this publication series that, again, all of this is downloadable in PDF. And now we have a symposium at the Latin American Studies Association coming up in Montreal in the fall, in September, where we'll be presenting a series of panels with our scholars. And then finally, data repositories, universities in the US that have linked to us that take our data and deposit it and make it available for their student bodies. And we have a growing network of people like that. This is the cover of the presentation. This happens to be Bolivia 2006. And this is the presentation we made down there in Bolivia. This is the U.S. ambassador and my 2 Bolivian graduate students presenting. We first presented it to the foreign aid community, and we presented it to him. And I mainly try to keep my students out there doing the presentations, less of the Mitch Seligson show. In the early days, it was just me. Now it's mainly them. And this is now at the Catholic University in La Paz, associated with the Harvard Program in International Studies, and we were out there giving a typical presentation to this kind of stuff. The Ecuador gets sort of a larger presentations, the Ecuador 2006. Here we were up at the stage with rectors of universities, my Ecuadorian student, a Bolivian student, and the speaker. And if you look at the audience, here we get large audiences, as many as 500 people in a large hotel room attend these things. We're up there speaking, and then of course, it's not only safe to listen to it. This guy was the president of Ecuador at the time. He was looking at the previous study, and shortly after that, he was arrested, and he was a coup, and that was the end of his power. So if you be careful if you read my studies, something like that may happen to you. But there's Lucio Gutierrez, his military bodyguard, and that was very shortly before the end of his run as president of the country. And here's the press interviewing me actually in Ecuador about this presentation in one of the hotels. I think this is in Guayaquil, Ecuador. Radio, the radio programs, and TV. This is, I guess, La Paz, Bolivia, talking about this surveys. And this is Colombia, where we have to do smaller presentations because of the extreme risks of assassination and kidnapping. So we tend to do it in smaller groups. It's Colombia and in Guatemala, where I'm always at risk of being murdered, so I try to do it a little carefully. And these are the covers of the 2006 surveys. This is what you'll see if you go on the web at the most recent ones. This is the one done in Panama, and this one, which is not still available because we just completed the French version of it, to be presented in Haiti. That's a 2006 Haiti version with our partners. Okay, let me get into the substance of the talk and give you a couple of ideas about what we're finding in terms of the extent to which Latin Americans are committed to democracy. I think it's probably appropriate to keep those tanks in mind because you'll see that in not every case that people think that democracy is the only game in town and the hottest thing. There are people who have a lot of questions about democracy in the region. Much survey research that's European-based tend to ask this question, satisfaction with democracy. It's the standard item being used. It's really a very poor item because it asks the question, how satisfied are you with democracy? And it confuses 2 different things, democracy and satisfaction with the way the government is operating. And it's not really clear that if people answer this question, I like it, or yes, I'm satisfied, that they're satisfied with the fact that the system is democratic, or they say, yeah, taxes are okay, the government's doing a good job, I have a good salary, and so on. When we ask that question, I just want to keep your attention on one item here. We asked that question in 2006. There's Bolivia, which looks like it's sort of just one tiny notch below the United States. And Bolivia's had, as I pointed out, that's where the tanks were and all those, murders, the police killing, the military killing of civilians. It would be awfully strange. You'd say, well, it looks like Bolivia is in great shape, that there is a very deep standing belief in general. You say that you're very satisfied, dissatisfied, and so on with in the way in which democracy functions in this country. And you'd say that things are really pretty good, and you look down here in Paraguay and Ecuador, and things aren't so great. So keep that particular point in mind. This is on a 0 to 100 scale, which almost all of my surveys get translated into, so you can sort of get the same metric throughout, low and high. Okay. I take a different approach to it, believing that the sentiment of satisfaction with democracy doesn't get us very far. And I tend to look a little deeper into the extent to which the population is committed to certain key values, basic values. And I think two of those values are really support for majority rule and minority rights. Okay? To put it pretty simply, if people don't think that majorities ought to rule, but at the same time that minorities have the right to participate in politics, majorities won't be in power because the people have belief in no legitimacy in the right to rule, and majorities can't ever come to power. Okay, we'll have constant chaos. So we look at these two dimensions, legitimization of the system and political tolerance, as two key dimensions that I think gets us a little profounder view of the extent to which people have some commitment not to just being satisfied with democracy, but the basic values underlying it. This is just one illustration. And we have sort of a theory that I think is worthwhile looking at for a moment. What we're arguing here is that in order for a system to have stable democracy, you ought to have a system in which people believe in the system, the right to rule, and people ought to be on the sort of the high end, not the low end. But at the same time, they ought to believe in the rights of the opposition. They ought to believe that people who don't agree with you on certain things should also have basic civil liberties. And so what we're arguing is that when people have that combination of values, that is, that they believe in the legitimacy system and they're willing to tolerate the rights of opposition, we're predicting in terms of a leading indicator of democratic stability that the country is going to be stable. In the time I have, let me just focus on the other side, democracy at risk. What about when people don't think the system is legitimate, A, and B, that they aren't willing to tolerate the rights of minorities? Our suggestion is that that means that if the system is democratic, it may well be at risk for instability in the years to come. How do we measure these things? Well, let me pull out one group of items. We have a 5-item series. B5 doesn't exist any longer. We removed it. These items were first developed in Germany back in the 70s. I first tested them in Costa Rica, also in the 70s, and they've evolved over the years. And we asked a series of to what extent do you believe that the courts in the United States guarantee a fair trial? Some people after the OJ trial may have had some second thoughts about that. To what extent do you have respect for the political institutions of the United States, or Venezuela, Costa Rica, Nicaragua? To what extent do you think that the basic rights of citizens are well protected by the political system? To what extent are you proud to live under, and to what degree do you support? And we ask these people, we give them a scale of 1 to 7. Even illiterate people know the numbers 1 to 10, and so we find it's pretty easy to work with this system. And we ask them what extent. We create an overall measure. When you do that, Bolivia changes a lot. The United States and Canada, we were pleased to see, actually are okay. And by the way, I want to point out that this data point was taken at very recently at the low point of the Bush presidency. And we know that the incumbent has an impact, sometimes a fairly strong impact on the case. So my guess is that this is a very low number for the United States, that we're under an extraordinarily low situation of extraordinarily low, unpopular president that may be dragging down some of these basic indicators. But Bolivia is much further down here on this system. Costa Rica, which is the oldest established democracy in the region, there was a civil war in the late 40s, and it's been a democratic system ever since, and indeed had deep democratic roots prior to that civil war. And it doesn't surprise me then that while Costa Ricans may be dissatisfied with the way democracy is running, in terms of belief in political legitimacy, they do quite well. By the way, I should also point out, keep your eye on Ecuador, and where you'll see Ecuador falling into this whole process. When we asked the same question in 2004, I want to point out that Bolivia was much lower down. And it's interesting to see that Bolivia jumped up quite a bit in this, and it was probably the most extraordinary change we've ever measured, because Bolivia underwent a system-wrenching change, really, from a situation in which for several hundred years the country had been run by presidents who were not associated ethnically with what many people argue is the self-identified ethnic majority of the country, that is the indigenous population. And for the first time, Evo Morales, representing that group, gets elected in Bolivia. And it really changes a lot of the way people think about the system. Remember, this is a 51.5, and this is where Bolivia was only 2 years earlier. I've never seen a change quite that abrupt before. Costa Rica ends up on the high end, as it normally does. Here we didn't have U.S. data, because we only got it when Vanderbilt contributed the funds to make the U.S. and Canada possible. Let's now flip to the other dimension, tolerance for minority rights. Tolerance is extremely difficult to measure. In the old days in the United States, people used to ask about tolerance for communists. Would you allow a communist to vote, to teach in your public schools and so on? The problem is that over time, people started saying, I don't care. I mean, communists, what's the difference? We're no longer in a Cold War. They could teach, okay. During the Cold War, it was a big deal. And so when you specify what you're tolerant towards or against, you run into the problem of that group changing over time and not being able to compare and not being able to compare across countries. Another way of asking the question, one that does not work in Latin America, is you give people a list of groups, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the KKK, Bin Laden, and so on, and you ask them, pick the group you like the least, okay? And then you say, would you give these people certain rights? The problem is that in Latin America, a lot of people don't like to say bad things about groups, so they don't pick any group. In Nicaragua, for example, 50% of the people we asked wouldn't identify any group. Even though we know a lot of them didn't like the Sandinistas, and others didn't like other groups, they wouldn't say it. Okay? So we came up with this more generic system. There are people who say only bad things about the governments of our country, not only the current one, but this is Bolivia. How strongly would you approve or disapprove of these rights? The right to vote, to carry out peaceful demonstrations, to run for public office, and to have free speech, to appear on TV. Basically what we're saying is that these are the basic civil liberties without which the minority could never become a minority. After all, if I can't vote, if I can't run for office, if I can't have free speech, how can I ever become part of the majority? Those are the items we ask. And we look at tolerance. And once again, the United States and Canada do pretty well, and it was particularly interesting to see that a country far poorer, Jamaica and Guyana, too, with British colonial traditions, actually score quite high on this, and maybe that's the causative factors, okay? They're pretty high. Notice, however, where Bolivia is, at the very bottom of the list. In fact, Bolivia is the only country we've ever measured where education has no impact whatsoever on tolerance. People who have primary education, secondary education, and university education have the same extremely low level of tolerance for the rights of minorities. So we need to factor that in. We can't just look at legitimacy. We've got to look at the tolerance that they have towards the system. And notice where Ecuador is on this. Okay, let's now put this together. This was the scheme I worked out between legitimacy being high and tolerance being high and being low. When you put the two together, this is where you end up. With the United States and Canada, sort of to my relief, but maybe not to anyone's surprise, they actually did okay. That is, the percentage of the population here is into the 2/3 group of the people who are in that cell. Remember, we're talking about this cell right here. Okay? And there's Bolivia down there. So if you use the first item, satisfaction democracy, Bolivia is, right next to Switzerland, okay? And it's on its way to stable democracy. If you take a little deeper look, Bolivia doesn't look as good, in part because of lower levels of legitimacy, but also because of low levels of tolerance. But Ecuador managed to come out on the bottom of the thing. It should be no surprise that there's been musical chair after music. I just showed you the president who listened to my talk and then got dismissed. But Bolivians have been losing office, being thrown out of office by protest marches in the military for some time. So this gives you some idea about what the percentage of the population is in that stable democracy cell. If I flip it around, let me go back up here, the democracy at risk cell, where we end up in the United States and Canada with about 5% of the population. Maybe those are the people who are sympathetic with Oklahoma City and maybe the ones who cheered on 9/11, I don't know. But those are the people who are the really alienated population. They neither believe in legitimacy of the system, nor are they willing to tolerate the rights of minorities. Look at Ecuador up there in terms of the percentage of the population in that cell. What we're saying is democracy is not going to collapse tomorrow morning. This doesn't predict a military coup. What it's saying is you're involved in a system in which the political culture is not propitious for the continuation of elected democratic regimes. These are systems that have significant weaknesses that could, in fact, be very weak. There's Bolivia up there. Could be very weak when people don't like what's going on. And if you've been following the news at all with respect to Bolivia and Ecuador, right now, 57 elected members of the legislature in Ecuador got into a tangle with the electoral tribunal, and he fired them all. And so now we have 57 of the 100 members of the Ecuadorian legislature are not allowed to enter the legislature. They went into a hotel, and the population attacked them and beat them. Okay, So imagine the Senate being surrounded, being told to get out, the senators, and then going to a hotel and then having the population attack you. And that's what's going on right now in Bolivia. Ecuador suggests a population that's intolerant and suggests a population that doesn't doesn't have a very warm spot for the legitimacy of the legislature in that country. Let me talk for just a moment about a subject we'll be dealing with in a conversation in the political science department in a few minutes from now, actually at 12 o'clock. The rise of the left. I can only talk about this for just one or two moments, and I want to turn to you for questions and answer. In Latin America, there's been an increasing movement towards the political left in a part of the world that's actually politically on the right. When we compare Latin Americans' attitudes, we give them a scale of left to right, with left being 1 and right being 10 on a scale. And we look at them, we compare them to other countries around the world. The worldwide average is right around 5, and Latin Americans are right around 5, but somewhat more to the right than the world as a whole. In the past couple of years, when we compare our results to what we found a few years ago, Latin America has nonetheless moved significantly to the left from that rightist position. Still towards the center right, but moving towards the left. And many, many governments in Latin America have been elected of the left. In addition to that, there has been the resurgence of what we can call populist regimes. We spent the morning discussing the question of how to define populist regimes, and it's not easy. My definition has a lot to do with whether or not we have presidents who believe that there should be direct democracy. I'll listen to you, my people, and we don't need these little things like legislatures and courts to interpret popular will and to determine what about the rule of law. I'll determine it because I know what's best for our country. We have some leaders in Latin America who take that position, the most important of whom is Chavez in Venezuela. Well, the question is, what does this mean for democracy? And we have a couple of indications here, and I literally just completed this paper just a few days ago, and so this is the stuff that we're still trying to work through. But when we ask a question about legitimacy that you talked about, and what you saw and that was so important, what we see is that, interestingly enough, in Latin America, the left, talking about the countries as a whole, are much lower on legitimacy, significantly lower on legitimacy than the right. Okay. Now, we already know that legitimacy is tied up with our theory about democratic political stability, so one wonders, as Latin America trends towards the left, and it doesn't mean that worldwide people on the left are low on legitimacy on the right. In Latin America at this time, that's what we're finding. We ask another question, which we call the Churchill question. Churchill is alleged to have said, democracy is a terrible system, but it's the best system that we've ever seen, given all others. And so we ask a question like that. We ask people to react to the Churchill question. Democracy has got a lot of problems, but is it better than anything else? And what we find here is that it's the right that says that as opposed to the left. Two suggestions that there may be difficulties as Latin America moves to the left and elects leftists, that there may be lower levels of legitimacy and there may be a significant problem in terms of democracy's sustainability. When we asked about the tolerance dimension, again, I'm only dealing with a very few things here, what we see is that this is populism and this is tolerance, okay? And the more populist, we have a series of items we developed just for this survey, 5 items on measuring the extent to which people are committed to populism. And as their populism goes up, their levels of tolerance goes down. Okay, another troubling finding that makes us wonder whether the movement towards populism, the Chavez-style populism, perhaps or other styles of populism, might move Latin America in a less tolerant way, in a less supportive democracy, in a less in lower levels of legitimacy. Let me now mention just a few final points. One is on corruption, and then I'll deal with ethnicity. One of the things we measure, and we've gotten to be pretty good at measuring, is something that's typically very difficult to measure, which are about bribery. I sort of began this thing saying bribery is about the same everywhere. There are bribes here in the U.S., there's bribes in Latin America, and it's not going to make such a big difference. Although I just spent some time cautioning someone who was going to go to Ecuador, one of your professors, about not getting caught in a bribe scam in stores. But at any rate, let's talk about this. I talk about it was in Ecuador, and I was talking about bribery. I had just been forced to pay, get into a scam in a store, and I was pretty irritated that day. But this is Ecuadorians about bribery, and we ask a series of questions, not whether you think there's a lot of bribery around, but whether you personally have been victimized by corruption. Stopped by a cop and asked to pay a bribe to a cop, being asked to pay a bribe to a public official, which is the item we'll compare with all the other countries in Latin America, in the local government, at work, in the health service, and in the school system. For example, in a place like Ecuador, 30% of the kids parents have to pay bribes to get them into public school, which is a bad way to socialize children about, or maybe a good way to socialize children about the way Ecuador works. Okay, that is, they get to know from first grade on that the way you manage a system is to pay bribes. Let's take a look at these numbers, which are kind of outstanding, astonishing really. In political science, social science, we normally don't see gigantic gaps. We see, well, people are a little higher, a little lower. This one is this is 2 times as much, and so on. We asked this question in Canada, the United States, and we got 0.5% and 1/3% of the population telling us that they had to pay a bribe to a public official in the year prior to the interview. Look at this number up here in Ecuador. Okay, this is Haiti, this is Ecuador. Okay, we're talking about 12.3% of the population telling us that they had, in this one item on our series, so we're talking about numbers here. If you compare the United States, we're talking about 24 times the volume of the population that say they've had to pay a bribe in that one instance to a public official in the year prior to the survey, the 2006 survey. But consider this, when we take our entire series of items on corruption, and we can't use US and Canada because we didn't use those items, we had limited funds and limited time. So let's just look at Latin America. We get down at this end where the countries that are the cleanest have a little less than 10% of the population saying that in the year prior to the survey, they had to pay a bribe. And when you get to Haiti, it's half of the population. 1 out of every 2 people tells us that they've had to pay a bribe in the school, in the health system, at work, or something. At least one of these experiences is the total corruption. Police, public municipality, work, courts, public health, and so on. This 7-item series. Okay, so it means that within a 2-year period, chances are just about everyone has been exposed to bribery. This is, by the way, the adult voting age population, so it's 18 and over, except in Nicaragua where the voting age is 16. What does this do in terms of legitimacy? Going back to my items, we are dealing with the system support item we talked about earlier as legitimacy. The more times you've been victimized by corruption, I didn't put more countries on here because it would have been impossible to read. In every one of the countries, the more you've been victimized, the lower you believe in the legitimacy of the system. After all, they're saying, this government is not protecting me. In fact, it's victimizing me. It's allowing me to have to pay a bribe to get my kid into school, to go see a doctor in the public health service, okay, to carry out a transaction in the birth certificate at the local municipality. I've got to pay a bribe in order to get it. So it erodes legitimacy. Let's look at it just in one extreme case, Ecuador. This is the national mean of legitimacy. Low, way below 50, as I pointed out before. And here's what happens to people the more they've been exposed to corruption. Okay? The more they are, the lower they are in belief in legitimacy of the system. Finally, a last theme is the challenge of ethnicity. Let's talk about Bolivia. Some of us think that we're born with our ethnicity, okay? We have Hispanic identity or Italian identity or Jewish identity or whatever our particular identity is. In Latin America, one of the interesting things is indigenous identity. And when we look at Bolivia, let's take an examination of it. This is people participating in protests in Bolivia. Bolivians are incredible that way. They're the highest we've ever measured. Bolivians participated in extraordinary high rates of protest marches and so on. I didn't actually include the U.S. on this. I have to redo this slide. But this is where Bolivians are compared to places like El Salvador. Over 1/3 of the population in the last year had engaged in protests. Let's look at this now in terms of another variable, in terms of ethnicity. What's happened since our first surveys in Bolivia is the percentage of the population who would self-identify as white has gone way down, and the percentage of the population that's identified as indigenous has gone way up. If you're looking at electoral terms, that explains Evo Morales' victory as an indigenous representative running for office under that banner in Bolivia. The indigenous population has gone way, way up, whereas in a country like Guatemala, ethnic identity is practically stable. It doesn't change decade after decade. What does this mean in terms of our population? Well, here's the indigenous population in terms of protest participation in El Alto, the area right outside of La Paz, the capital of the city, which is where the plane lands when you fly into Bolivia. And here's the protest marches of the indigenous population in El Alto compared to the non-indigenous population. Much more active in protests. What does this mean in terms of political legitimacy? This is the El Alto area, highly indigenous. This is the rest of Bolivia. Okay, legitimacy much higher. This is before the election of Evo Morales. My guess is, and I have a chance to see it, that these two things have now switched entirely. Okay, with the alienated population, maybe the white population, the self-identified white, as opposed to indigenous. And let me end by looking at this particular thing here. This is Santa Cruz, Bolivia, an area which has a low percentage of indigenous population and doesn't share many of the values of the highly indigenous population that we see here. This is Santa Cruz. This we ask the question. I'm sorry, I didn't realize this is in Spanish. Percentage of the population who are in agreement with splitting the country, dividing the country. And what's happened between the 2004 and 2006 is a dramatic increase of the population that says, we want out of here. Okay. I mean, it was a time ago, but after all, the United States went through its own civil war. These are the kind of sentiments that can produce that kind of outcome. Okay, I'll end it that way, and I'll take your questions and see if you can have any questions about the method or the substance or about your own particular country.
For the corruption surveys, that was just within the last year. Did you thought maybe doing the last 5 years or see if that percentage changed at all?
This is the problem. Survey research has limitations, as all methodologies do. And one of the early studies done by the University of Michigan, which is sort of the prime place for this, is that when you ask people about things going back over time, memory can be very, very problematical and misleading. So they asked people, they went and got things you can't do nowadays. They got hospital records of people who have been hospitalized, and they looked at sort of embarrassing diseases versus non-embarrassing diseases. And they went out and asked the people who had been hospitalized. They knew what the answer was. Did you, and within 6 months and 8 months and 10 months, people's recall of those things tend to get blocked out. So what we did is we have confined ourselves to the year frame, even wondering about that as memory fades. Traumatic experiences that happen to people, terrible losses, people don't forget. But when you live in an environment like Haiti, where this is happening all the time, it's sort of like, this is life, right? This is what it is. So it isn't any big trauma when someone hits you up for a bribe. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm from Ecuador.
Okay.
You remind me, of many.
You're hiding under the table after what I just said. No,
sorry. And I really love to be in America. I've been here for 9 years, and I remember.
Speak up loudly so they can. Yeah.
Being in my country, my mom had to pay a bribe when I wanted to be in a public school because it was one of the good ones in the country. And so this is the reality of my country, which is kind of sad for me.
But you knew that. At that age, I mean, what grade? Were you just getting into first grade or high school?
That was in 5th grade.
5th grade, okay. So you were aware then. You were very aware that this stuff was going on.
And my father is completely from. He is Portuguese descendant, so he is completely the right person, completely in the right side. My mom is left part, and this is, I think, one of the things I want to ask you is, how do you, the surveys? How do you do that? Because people tend sometimes to exaggerate. Some people sometimes think to try to keep the things inside because they feel fear. And so how is this accurate? I mean, from my point of view, from the reality I've lived when I lived in my country, it's 100% accurate.
Okay, first of all measurement has error. If you've taken any physics courses, you know about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The mere fact that we're in the household talking to people, we're interfering with their thinking process and we're having an impact on them. Second, people can hide all kinds of things. For example, one of the things we find in surveys in the United States, you ask shortly after the election results come out, who do you vote for? Many more people claim to vote for the winner than who actually voted for the winner, because we have the election returns and we know that people just tend to, they want to look good. So we recognize that all surveys have error. And it could well be that the corruption figures that were, but when I first started doing corruption measurement, which was 1996, I assumed not only that it was pretty much the same everywhere, that no one would tell me this. No one would tell our interviews. I was astounded to the extent to which people were willing to talk about having been bribed, mainly because they're angry about the process. It could be that half of the people who have had to pay a bribe don't admit it. What we're assuming is that all of the error, and there's lots of error in all measurements, such as how to get from here to the moon, there's error. But we don't want to be so far off that we're going to not end up on the moon and somewhere else. We hope that the relative proportions, so when I tell you Haiti's at 50 and Canada and the United States are at 0.05, that probably reflects that Haiti is much more corrupt than is Canada. Whether that number 50 is something that you want to say, that's an absolute truth, probably not. And it's the same with all of these figures. If you ask Ecuadorians whether they paid a bribe in the school, some of them who did won't admit it, some of them who did won't remember it, and others will tell us the answer. And since we do, like in the case of Ecuador, we interview 3,000 people, we have large samples, and we're dealing with the relationships among the data. Do people who suffer corruption victimization have less respect for the legitimacy of the institutions of government? And the answer is yes. That's what we want to know, which has important policy implications. If I am telling, as I do, because one of the things I do is I advise the US government, one of the things I tell them is, well, if you're going to try to get greater stability of democracy, think about corruption, because it's undermining, it's eroding the support of the population for their system. So think about trying to work on anti-corruption programs, which isn't easy, by the way. How do you break? How do what? Yeah.
I'm different. I came to America because of my father. Without him, the education I received was very socialistic. We have many Cubans and Russian teachers. I mean, people who went to Russia for studies, and they came with the social ideas, and they really, at least my mind, the mind of my brothers, it was totally corrupt by socialistic ideas. He went to the guerrilla in Colombia. All my cousins from the 80s, all Generation X in Ecuador. It was a very, very socialistic generation, which I'm so glad that I grew up with different ideas because of my father, and he believed that I could get a better education in America.
Well,
I was very lucky.
I'm an educator, and so I sort of, my life has been spent, teaching, and I would like to think that one of the things that we can do on the corruption side is to delegitimize corruption. That is, through civics lessons and through a lot of other efforts, through plays and acts and all kinds of things, we can try to show students, what the right way and the wrong way. If it begins in the home and ends in the home, and that's where all of it is, there's not too much we can do short of taking the kids out of the home. But in Bolivia, for example, we found that when we found that education wasn't producing tolerance, we wanted to find out what the civics curriculum was in Bolivia. What were they teaching the kids in the schools? We found is they were teaching them about military heroes. That was civics. Okay, it wasn't teaching them principles of respect minorities, that there's a voting system, and that in the end there's a winner and a loser, and you have to do that. That we weren't trying to teach them. They weren't trying to teach them civil libertarian lessons, but they were rather teaching them to glorify the leaders. So what we transmit to our children, and what apparently is being transmitted in the universities in Bolivia, at least, is not a measure of respect others, but rather they're the enemy, get them, and that isn't going to lead to any.
Two quick questions. One, you used a 7-point scale for your legitimacy question, and a 10-point scale for your minority question.
Good.
I was wondering why you did that.
Very observant.
And the second question is, you didn't have the U.S. on your little slide, and you mentioned that. Just out of curiosity, where did it lie, and what was the value for the corruption?
For which one?
Was it corruption?
The 7-point corruption.
No, it was one of the most recent slides. You just said, I don't have this on.
It was a protest.
The protest.
Yeah, I don't know the end. It was only literally. This is really fresh stuff. I'm just doing it now because the data sets we still have Brazil to complete, so we don't have all of our work. But so I don't have the answer on what the protest thing in the U.S. My guess is that it's going to be way low compared to Bolivia. That is, we live at a time where one would think, given that we're engaged in a war, that there would be, at least on campuses, massive demonstrations. But I would say, because we don't have a draft, that there is a sort of, and it's fairly cynical in saying that, is that who cares? If those guys who volunteered, let them get killed. I think there's a fair amount of that in the thing. But protest marches are not very common in the United States, and you just ask yourselves, how many are there here on the campus, and how many are there on other campuses? Your second question is really actually a good methodological one. The whole problem of how to measure things, your question, is a complex area. A lot of surveys just ask yes and no. And there's no, people have actually value or attitudes that are more subtle than that. But how subtle? If I asked you on a 1,000-point scale, your attitude towards, Bush or Gore, you say 1,000 points. I can't distinction between 696. No, I like Bush and I'm kind of favorable, and on a 1 to 7, So what's happened is they found that we work at the University of Illinois, they found that 7 points they tended to think was about as good as you were going to get it. And they started using 7 points when we developed this work in the 70s. Later it became clearer and clearer to me that in much of Latin America, using the metric system, that people think in tens and report cards, you get a 10, so I started shifting my work over to the 10 format. And so the things I developed subsequent to that are more and more likely to use a 10-point scale.
It seems intuitive that you use an even point scale rather than an odd one, because an odd one people tend to gravitate toward the middle if they don't have.
But that's the problem. The problem with the left to right, which is in this administration on most 1 to 10, 5 is not the middle, but people think it is. And a lot of people want to jump to the middle, and so would you end up? You need to have a 5.5. What we find is that overwhelmingly worldwide, people are picking that 5. And so what we like to give them, and the ideal would be rather than a 1 to 10, a 0 to 10. But it turns out that seems to make no difference. The 0 sort of drops off. They see the 5 and they go there. And we've done that experiment, and it doesn't matter. 5 is the middle.
Maybe try 8 or something.
It's always a.
4, I guess.
The few minutes that's left because I got another thing.
Ask, on your legitimacy, Chile fell into about the middle. Whereas on corruption, they had the least corruption on the scale of the ones that you showed. And you established there's a relationship between those two. Right.
What we're in a multivariate universe here. What I was isolating out is a single variable, namely the impact of corruption victimization on legitimacy. In the multivariate analysis, you'll see other things. For example, education, gender, wealth, political party, who did you vote for in the last election. All these things have an impact on your dependent variable. And I was highlighting only one. So where Chile is vis-a-vis other countries actually that's a very complicated issue. Where is Chile versus the other? Chile is a country that had come from a long period of dictatorship, recently re-democratized, and is building its own legitimacy in part through strong accomplishments on the economic side. The United States and Canada have been doing democracy for a long time, okay, and it's not surprising that they're up there. Okay, so don't assume that just because of that single variable, low corruption in Chile, that Chile ought to be what you would predict that over time, if Chile maintains low levels of corruption and reasonable economic performance, they would continue to increase their levels of legitimacy. Okay, this should be the last question I would take. Yeah.
I was wondering, on that chart where you had all the indigenous identity, I was wondering, I didn't see Ecuador there, and I was curious.
You didn't see?
Ecuador, I didn't see it in that. I mean, I know you had Bolivia, Guatemala, etc.
But on which chart?
About the indigenous communities, or the indigenous.
Well, yeah, Ecuador is actually Ecuador, Guatemala and Bolivia are the two countries with the largest indigenous populations. Ecuador turns out.
Several Central American countries. You had several Central American countries, and you had Bolivia, and I was just curious about why.
Yeah, it turns out that in Ecuador, the percentage of the population that self-identify using an appropriate, one of my dissertators is working on this very subject, appropriate definition of ethnicity is only 5%. Whereas the Census Bureau claims that there's a huge percentage of the population, largely because they ask the question, do you sympathize with indigenous populations? And the Census Bureau says, no, I sympathize with them, but I'm not one. And so But I'm sorry, well, what I suggest, if there are things I didn't see, go to that website, okay? You can download any, these reports that are a couple hundred pages in length in 2 languages, and see any stuff, and then you can actually do your own data analysis online.